In this chapter, we will have a very brief look on how creative processes that suggest improvisational practices are present in non-European musics. The musical traditions that we will explore are well known for their long histories in both performance and education, which in that regard makes them comparable to so-called Western art music. You may have noticed my cautious use of the term improvisation here. This is due to the fact that in order to apply this term to the non-European musics that we will explore, we need to be aware of our own cultural determination. By doing so, we want to try to avoid falling into the trap of unconsciously and thus blindly applying certain perspectives which originate from the Western cultural context and which seem almost self-evident to us, to other cultural experiences and traditions. For a long time in music and almost any other art form, the productions and practices that have emerged from Western or Occidental traditions were considered the only valid standard, which is no surprise as the discourse was mostly dominated by Western academic institutions. Anything that did not belong to this tradition was all too carelessly considered primitive, folkloristic, or outdated in a historic sense, implying an inferiority and irrelevance. Such arrogant and biased views have fortunately been increasingly questioned and revised in recent decades. Today we find such processes of re-evaluation not only reflected in the sciences, but also represented in the everyday artistic practice of our globalized world. Schools and academies are recognizing that their task is not only to maintain Western traditions and dominions, but that an important goal and challenge lies precisely in recognizing and understanding the dynamic developments of the globalized present, and therefore necessarily includes non-Western cultural traditions. The method of contemporary ethnomusicology, for example, considers musical traditions and their modes of production in their respective historical and socio-cultural context. It applies the same approach also to European art music or jazz, just to name those two, by making them into objects of investigation. This approach renders ethnomusicology an important instrument that enables us to critically discuss and understand given traditional concepts and role distributions within their respective contexts. We will, in a later part of this course, have a closer look at Paul Berliner's groundbreaking study on jazz improvisation as a vivid example of this approach. In connection with our subject, improvisation, a significant tenet of the Western musical canon is the strict binary separation of the terms composition and improvisation. As we shall see, however, behind this juxtaposition, which we might take for granted, there is no compelling need to separate these into two fundamentally different principles or processes. We find a comparable duality in the separation of composer and performer. Both seem at first glance to be clearly distinguishable roles. But if we look at the matter from the perspective of artistic production, even this categorical definition of authorship does not look as self-evident and unproblematic as it might initially seem. If we understand improvisation in its nature as a creative, explorative and playful activity, it is obvious that we can also see in it a very elementary human creative practice. This applies to the phylogenetic development of man as well as to the ontogenetic development of the individual. We will discuss this aspect in more detail in the chapter on improvisation and music therapy. But for now, we can perhaps assume in simple terms that our early ancestors began to make music as a group of improvisers, and furthermore, that starting in early childhood development, every human being discovers his or her social and representational world by means of improvised creative play. It is therefore not surprising that in the artistic practice of many musical cultures of the world, this playful and creative aspect that we might relate to the term improvisation is much more evident and less obstructed and disguised than it seems to be the case in Western art music. We will revisit this point in the next chapter when we actually come to talk about Western art music more in detail. Let's take Persian, Indian or Korean art music for example. And any of these great music traditions would deserve a much closer look. But as our time is limited, allow me to use them as combined examples for my argument. All these musics have century-old traditions and require both very long studies and the highest degree of skill from the performers. In all three of these musical traditions, composition in the sense of a fixed traditional organization of the material certainly plays a very important role. And in this regard, they are very similar to Western art music. At the same time, the focus of musical understanding and appreciation lies on the emphasis on performance. It is understood that the musicians who perform the music transform it into sound and thus bring it into life and into the experience of others. This has also a direct influence on music education and how the musicians are being trained, which is less biased on exercises and works written down in music notation, but rather an oral transfer and practical exchange by a master who is both a teacher and an able performer and a student. The learning process is thus already characterized by a practical and explorative approach. At the same time as learning the complex traditional idiomatic material and imitating their master, the students are required to find and develop elements of their own expression. These can take the form of musical embellishments, decorations, variations, etc. within the framework of relatively narrow idiomatic guidelines. Or it can be executed in extensive form parts or passages that serve primarily this purpose. The mastery of the musician is measured in his or her ability to do justice to both the traditional guidelines and their creative and individual implementation and redesign. We can certainly understand such an approach towards performance as an improvisational process, but we must remember not to apply a rigid understanding of the term improvisation that formulates itself as an antithesis to the term composition. In fact, these musical traditions show us that the Western division and elimination of the terms composition, interpretation and improvisation is quite questionable and even not appropriate, at least not here. They suggest that if viewed from within the practical context of music making, we can perhaps understand these terms rather as different modes of creation. They do not mark rigid boundaries, but rather connect and flow into each other. We will see in the next chapter that this similar ideal and practice was also very much alive at times in Western art music. And more so, we will argue that the notion of a strict separation of composition, interpretation and improvisation is quite problematic, even in its well-established context of Western art music. In this chapter, we have briefly considered the role of improvisation in some non-European art music traditions. We have seen that of utmost importance is not the presentation of works, but rather the creative reinterpretation of traditional material within the framework of the established idiom. As a result of this, the functional and hierarchical distinction between composer, interpreter, and a performer-improviser is less rigid. It is the artistic quality and sensory life experience of the performance that is essential in this setting. And as I have previously argued, it might be worthwhile to question Western terminology, as it might indeed come with some culturally biased implications. In the case of our main topic, improvisation, it might be very helpful to liberate our understanding of the term from its more recent Western coinage and contextualization, as it narrows our perspective. Please do not forget to listen to the audio podcast that accompanies this and any of the following chapters, as this will be the place where I will discuss the given topic more in depth with my knowledgeable guests. We will continue our investigation by looking at Western art music in the next chapter. Thank you, and see you there.